Hello everyone, and welcome to the 262nd episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Shogo Makishima from Psycho-Pass. If you're an anime and manga fan, which I'm guessing you are, be sure to check out a project I've been trying to support in any way I can, Death Veil, which is a new dark fantasy manga written and illustrated by my friends Kayadis and Daggerath that's currently trying to gain the funding needed so they can make their dream into a reality. So consider clicking the card on your screen, or the link in the description, to see if it's something you might be interested in. Now at this point, I've covered a lot of different villains that many of you have requested I cover from all sorts of media. And so far, I've been fortunate enough that I've yet to cover a character or a story that I didn't appreciate in some way. But sometimes you guys throw me a suggestion that ends up becoming not just something I appreciate, but something or someone that I consider to be one of my favorite pieces of media, or characters of all time. And I have to say, Psycho-Pass, at least the first season, as well as Shogo Makishima, have become one of those favorites. This story is now easily in my top 10 personal favorite animes. One that's deep, layered, complex, and overall just fantastic. A story that had me hooked from nearly the very beginning of the first episode. You might have noticed that I said the first season of it though, and that's because so far, that's all I've seen. So everything we discuss in this video is going to be centered around what we see happening there. And I'll delve more into its characters and themes in later videos, as this is definitely a series that I'd like to revisit on this channel someday. With that in mind though, for Sibyl specifically, which I'll be talking about a lot here, all the information I'll be presenting to you is from Season 1, so if something from later seasons supports or contradicts anything I talk about here, that would be why, and I'll address anything that other seasons add to its story at a later date. But with all that being said, I believe it's time we get into the video proper, so without further ado, let's begin. The alternate future presented to us in Psycho-Pass is one that is, on the surface, utopic and idyllic, and in many ways, it is. But no system, no society, no matter how perfect it may seem, is truly perfect. And that's more than true for Sibyl-governed Japan, especially for people who don't quite fit into the world they've designed, like Shogo Makishima. For all intents and purposes, Makishima is both an anomaly and an enigma, as we're never given any concrete information about his backstory. At one point, Kogami and Professor Saiga speculate that, as a result of his status as a criminally asymptomatic person, Makishima may have lived an isolated and lonely existence because he didn't fit in with society. Though this was speculation on their part, Makishima seems to confirm this during his final confrontation with Kogami when Kogami runs this by him. And while we have no way of actually confirming whether or not Kogami is correct, and Makishima is affirming that, it makes a lot of sense if this was the primary reason he developed his insidious worldview. In this seemingly perfect future for Japan, the Sibyl system and the psychopasses that it creates for people are everything. Through Sibyl, your brain is constantly scanned and measured to provide you with what it is determined to be the best match for you professionally, socially, and recreationally. And along with that, it's also responsible for keeping a constant watch over the populace in order to quickly identify and deal with any criminality, either through therapeutic means or termination. It's the system that educates you, that assigns you your job, that judges your physical and mental health, and assigns care for you accordingly. It's your judge, jury, and executioner. It's your source of news, entertainment, and information. In short, Sibyl is all-consuming, and if you aren't a part of it, then you really aren't a part of anything, and that's what criminally asymptomatic people are. A criminally asymptomatic person is a person who's incapable of being accurately judged in any way by Sibyl, thus rendering them essentially a non-person in this society. A person whose hue is colorless, and thus one whose life cannot be directed or assimilated into the greater whole that Sibyl has created. Just as important as their inability to be evaluated, however, is their lack of, or minimal crime coefficient. Perhaps the most important aspect of psychopasses is a metric I just mentioned called hue. Each individual's stress level is measured through their hue using a color scheme. Different colors mean different things, with certain colors like light blue and pink being ideal. But more importantly, a person's stress level is measured by the appearance of one's hue, with clear-colored hues being ideal and indicating low stress levels, and cloudy ones denoting a person with high stress levels. The clearness and cloudiness of your hue is what determines your crime coefficient, a number that steadily decreases the more stressed you become until you reach a breaking point. And once your coefficient surpasses 100, the system determines you to be a latent criminal who is then able to be paralyzed by the dominators employed by the Public Safety Bureau. And if your coefficient passes 300, you're considered a threat to society and are then able to be terminated through the use of a dominator. However, as I just mentioned, criminally asymptomatic people, in addition to having pure white hues, also have crime coefficients of 0 or near 0, and that number never changes no matter what they may be doing or thinking. It doesn't matter if a criminally asymptomatic person is out shopping or murdering someone in front of a crowd, their hue and coefficient stays the same. What this means is that these people who are outside the system are essentially capable of gaming the system in any way they wish. The greatest tool at Sibyl's disposal are psychopath scanners, ever-present tech equipped to drones, buildings, and street lamps to monitor every single person for irregularities in order to ensure a peaceful and orderly society is maintained at all times. As much as this new world revolves around a person's stress level, it also creates added stress as people are ever mindful of their hues and what might happen to them if they can't maintain them. But criminally asymptomatic people don't have to worry about this because no scanner is capable of measuring them at all. So in a world where everything from food to entertainment is at your disposal with only a few taps of a touchscreen, a criminally asymptomatic person would, in theory, enjoy even more privileges than the average person, as they can both take advantage of the system and do whatever they want outside of it as well. But that theory doesn't hold any water in practice, as the whole reason we've been discussing these aspects of society in this world is to emphasize what I mentioned a while ago about Shogo Makishima and loneliness. As I mentioned earlier, if you aren't able to be measured by Sibyl, for all intents and purposes, you don't exist. Without accurate measurements, Sibyl can't determine what job you're best suited for, the hobbies that would resonate with you most, or the friends you'd best fit in with, and it can't measure whether or not you're a saint or a demon. Thus, criminally asymptomatic people are isolated in every sense of the word, for as far as Sibyl is concerned, they aren't friends, lovers, family members, co-workers, or even acquaintances. To Sibyl, they have no intelligence, skills, or passions, but most importantly, no worth. Now, the term criminally asymptomatic people is unique to the world of psychopaths, but if we attempt to correlate that designation with labels we assign to people in our own world, are there any that we can determine to be an accurate match? Yes, there is. Antisocial personality disorder. To Sibyl, people like Shogo Makishima are criminally asymptomatic people. But if we take a look at who Makishima is, what he does, and what he intends to accomplish in this story, we find ourselves faced with a psychopath, a designation we use to denote people who display certain symptoms of ASPD. And criminally asymptomatic people, being the same as people suffering from ASPD, only makes too much sense. The development of ASPD within an individual is primarily caused by experiencing one or a combination of two things during their development: abuse and neglect. It's nearly impossible to find someone suffering from this disorder who wasn't forced to contend with either of these things in their youth. Terrible atrocities forced upon their minds and bodies by the people closest to them that warp them in ways few of us care to imagine. Because that's true, the fact that criminally asymptomatic people deemed to be outside the system, a system that in many ways is an ever-present parental figure, as well as being the foundation of every single thing in this new world, are neglected by that system. Children locked in invisible cages who are starved of purpose, community, and meaning in their lives. So because Makishima was maligned by this system and made into a monster as a result, is what he attempts to do in this story justifiable? No, his actions certainly aren't, but parts of his philosophy definitely are. And to understand why that is, we need to take a deeper look into Sibyl and its pros and cons. One of the big reveals in this story is that Sibyl, rather than being a centralized computer system run by an AI, like you might assume it would be, is actually comprised of a hive mind consisting of over 200 brains taken from criminally asymptomatic people. The Sibyl system is said to use a PDP model, an extensive network of supercomputers performing parallel distributed processing. It's not really a lie, but it's far from the truth. Its ability to utilize a knowledge base and to perform inferences was not solely achieved by speed gains in conventional computing. By parallelizing the system that was able to do those things and expanding it mechanically, it was just given massive processing ability. The fact is that a system that expands and speeds up its ability to think by incorporating human brain activity was already put into practical use more than 50 years ago. Precisely because we kept this technology secret and used it carefully, today our country is able to function as the only country on Earth ruled by law. The system currently has 247 constituent members. By having about 200 of the 247 connected in sessions at any given time, we can continuously monitor and judge the psychopaths of every single person in this country. After all, the ability to judge using only mechanical programs is limited to stress measurements based on the hue check at best. Specifying crime coefficients, which indicates a more profound human nature, requires a higher degree of thinking ability and judgment, and we are the ones who can make it happen. This is an explanation of Sibyl's origin and makeup that Kozaburou Toma gives to Makishima after his capture, and afterwards, they have the following exchange. What a joke. Management of a fair society by machines, a society that doesn't depend on human egos. People accepted the Sibyl system because that's how it was presented. And yet, it was actually done arbitrarily by you, an aggregate of human brains. No, it is boundlessly fair. We judge and supervise people. We are already an existence that transcends mankind. The first qualification to be a constituent member of the Sibyl system is to have an irregular personality that doesn't fit in with mankind's conventional standards. Without aimlessly empathizing with others, without being lost to emotion, you should be able to oversee human actions from an outsider's viewpoint. Such talent is desired. For example, like the way you and I are. I'm a unique human too, whose crime coefficient can't be determined from his psychopaths. Because of that, I've experienced a great deal of loneliness. A personality that cannot be measured even by Sibyl's collective intellect is called criminally asymptomatic. Those with this personality are distinguished from all citizens and have a new ideology and sense of values. By finding such valuable people and taking them in, the system has continued to expand its range of thinking and gain new possibilities as an intellectual form. Omnipotence achieved through the expansion of both understanding and judgment by sharing one's cognition with other brains. I feel like I'm a prophet right out of a myth. I understand everything. I feel that everything in the world is under my rule. There's a limit to the amount of pleasure a person can obtain, but pleasure brought out by intellect is infinite. This is the history of Sibyl as we know it, and how it's structured. A system built with the minds of psychopaths that runs nearly the entirety of Japanese society. As Kozaburo said, in creating this aggregate of criminal minds, Sibyl accomplishes something that no man-made system thus far has been able to accomplish. It's become a system built to serve and guide humanity that is not bound by the fallacies and pitfalls present in similar systems that are run by humans or machines. Sibyl doesn't just use data to make decisions. It uses real human consciousness that has been improved and perfected by the minds and perspectives of those outside the system in order to plug any holes and gaps present within it that may pop up over time. But because those human minds are devoid of things like moral restraints or empathy, they are able to judge and supervise dispassionately in a way that a machine might, while also understanding humanity on a deeper level, thus allowing for more precise and accurate policies and actions to be put into place that will statistically ensure the best possible outcomes in any given endeavor. Now, as great as that sounds, there are a lot, and I mean a lot of things this system doesn't take into account or is incapable of handling as far as governing society goes. But before we start discussing what those are, let's take a look at another explanation Sibyl provides for the correctness of itself when Akane is presented with the truth of Sibyl and calls it useless for being incapable of judging Makishima. You are right. The appearance of criminally asymptomatic people, whom the Sibyl system cannot analyze, is inevitable. No matter how detailed and robust a system you build, a certain number of irregularities that deviate from it are certain to appear. If we just improve the system and make it more complex, we can never expect it to be perfect. Then we have no choice but to resolve the contradictions by altering the way in which we operate the system, rather than its functions. By permitting the appearance of irregularities we cannot manage and taking measures to coexist, the system achieves perfection in a practical sense. We can entrust the management of the system to those who deviate from the system. That is the most logical conclusion. When we used to have individual personalities and bodies, we were all criminally asymptomatic persons who deviated from the management of the Sibyl system. There are even many among us who acted far more cruelly than Makishima. By first rejecting relative valuation such as good or evil, an absolute system can be established. What is needed is a perfect and infallible system. Who manages it is irrelevant. In a truly completed system, its operator's will is not questioned. Our will itself is the system and the universal standard of value that transcends ethics. The more prejudiced and peculiar the orientation of the individuals who comprise the system, the more new ideas and values it brings to our perception, and the more flexible and diversified our thinking becomes. In that regard, Shogo Makishima's idiosyncrasy is quite valuable. Attaining a logical society in which various contradictions and inequalities are resolved, that is, indeed, the ultimate happiness sought by the rational human mind. By achieving an absolutely perfect system, Sibyl has become an existence that embodies that ideal. Now all of this sounds wonderful, and theoretically, it would be, which is expanded upon further when Professor Saiga borrows from Max Weber and makes the following observation during a conversation with Kogami. Ideal bureaucrats are those who intently perform their duty without anger and fondness, without hate and zealousness, and without love and personal predilection. In that sense, the Sibyl system may be close to the ideal bureaucratic administration. Assuming all about Sibyl is true, bureaucratic administration dominates the people through knowledge, technical knowledge, and practical knowledge. Keeping that knowledge secret increases their superiority. Again, this sounds great in theory, but in practice, it's decidedly not. Isn't using the net just like using knives for cooking or using paper to write things down? It has nothing to do with good or bad. It's like, it's there, so we accept it and use it. This is a line from Akane that explains what Sibyl should be, a tool that should be making people's lives easier, but it's not. When Akane says this, she says it to Masoka, and Masoka responds by citing Rousseau's discourse on inequality. He states that humans are social creatures, and that all the communication tools that exist in the world are there in order to strengthen that social nature. He finishes his statement by asking Akane if she thinks the net has the same effect. She replies she thinks it does, but she knows deep down that it both does and doesn't. The net of the Psycho-Pass universe is like a more advanced form of the internet as we know it today, and the internet has done great things as far as communication goes. It's allowed us to speak to our friends and loved ones at a moment's notice with little to no hiccups, and because it's accessible by anyone across the globe so long as they have, well, access to it, we as a species have come closer together than we ever have before, and we've made great strides as far as coming to understand that those that are different than us are not so different after all, even if they live halfway across the planet. It's a wealth of both information and entertainment, and it's made it so more people are able to educate and entertain themselves in ways that were previously unimaginable, giving each and every person access to nearly all the collective knowledge of mankind at the touch of a button or the tap of a screen. That being said, for all the good the internet has brought about, it also has some very glaring downsides. The internet has made it much easier to communicate with others, but it's also made it much easier to communicate with them negatively, as it's a lot easier to be cruel and rude to people if you know you're never going to have to face the consequences of your actions. In that same vein, though we have near instant access to all manner of information, it's a lot easier for bad actors or people looking to push their own agendas to alter the truth and fool you into believing things that are falsified as they attempt to cater to each person's worldview and shape it as they will. When anything you read or watch is presented to you in colorful packaging or is laced with simple wording designed to keep you outraged, you tend to believe that information if it fits your own personal narrative, all the while never absorbing any of the facts that have been buried beneath mountains of misinformation. Not to mention how easy it is for people who have no idea what they're talking about to lecture you and browbeat you into believing you're a moron or a bad person for not being able to see their version of the truth. Add in the fact that bots are now rampant across the entire internet. It's getting harder and harder to trust that what you read online is really the truth, or if it's the version of the truth that people want you to see. Also, as much as the internet has brought us together, it's also made us more isolated, with more and more people choosing to live in their own bubbles and echo chambers in order to find comfort, which only degrades relations between people even further. The net under Sibyl is much the same, only 1,000 times worse. Just like the internet, in theory, it should just be a tool, one that brings people closer together and makes life better in so many different ways. But again, that theory doesn't hold much water because it's not a tool, it's everything. It's like an ever-present and omnipotent God that decides the fates of every person it's responsible for. And indeed, that's essentially what Sibyl is, the god of this futuristic society that's attempted to create a heaven on earth. You should forget about everything you learned there. None of that stuff is helpful when you actually work on a case. You think that's unreasonable, but you know, our work is made up of unreasonable things in the first place. What a person thinks, or what they wish for. We live in a time where everything in a person's mind can be made transparent by machines, and yet, there are tons of people who detest, deceive, or try to hurt others. If that's not unreasonable, what else would you call it? Everything you've been taught is based on theories and logic. Soon you'll come to realize how pointless they are. This is something Masoka says when Akane first joins the Bureau of Public Safety, and though he was talking about her time at the academy and police work here, it's very applicable to Sibyl as a whole. We live in a world of theories, a world where the ideas of others are constantly being tested, proven, and disproven in order to advance our understanding of the world at large and how best to make it a better place. The thing about theories, though, is that they deal heavily in logical thought processes. As when one has an idea and attempts to flesh out that idea, calculations need to be made. But theories and logic are always pointless when you don't factor in human nature. And that's why Sibyl is as flawed as it is. The way Sibyl judges the people of Japan is not through each individual's desires, dreams, or aspirations, but by comparing the data it collects through a person's brainwaves, that it then compares to previously collected data about what people with those brainwaves tend to want, that allows it to calculate what, in theory, is best for an individual. While that sounds fine, brainwaves aren't able to measure what lies in a person's soul. Maybe your brainwaves indicate that you have an interest in technology, so the system decides that you're best suited to be an engineer. But if the system had asked what about technology interests you, it might have learned that you're actually more interested in video games and have a desire to design them. What this accomplishes is a society filled with people who are doing what sort of makes them feel fulfilled, but leaves them empty in so many ways at the same time. To add further insult here, you don't even have a choice in the matter if you don't score well enough on Sibyl's tests. So even if it judges you to be fit for engineering, if you test poorly, you're given no option to improve and continue pursuing your favorite career path. Instead, you're given lesser options, like becoming an operator at a drone factory, with no hope that you'll ever be able to do anything else, as the system has declared you have the aptitude for it, and so you should also be happy doing it. What needs to be done is done by those capable of it, such as the grace bestowed upon mankind by Sibyl. That is how Sibyl presents itself, and how many people view it, but it's only a sham. A lie made from aggregated data that arbitrarily decides the course of each person's respective life without them ever having a say in it. You even need approval to be an artist, which ensures that whatever creativity a person might have is stifled by government oversight that doesn't allow for true artistic expression. And a quote from Rikako Oreo emphasizes quite well how everything to do with Sibyl's suppression of a person's creativity and free will inevitably leads to people feeling hollow. In this era, the system determines everyone's aptitudes, and we all have no choice but to live by it and be satisfied with only a happiness forced upon us, so we are unable to make our real dreams come true. However, what's worse than all of this is the way in which Sibyl judges people to be innocent or guilty through the use of crime coefficients. Crime coefficients can be effective and accurate as far as judging the danger a person poses to themselves or society at large, but as we see in the first episode of this series, it's also capable of great error. When Division 1 are attempting to apprehend Okura, the woman he was targeting, Chika Shimazu, becomes increasingly stressed as she's forced to deal with all the horror she's experienced in short order. And because of this, her crime coefficient increases to the point that the dominators label her a latent criminal who needs therapy, and eventually, one that needs to be terminated. What this reveals to us right away is the fact that crime coefficients are only measured through stress, and the system has judged that stressed out people are such a threat that they need to be labeled as latent criminals who need to be forced into attending therapy sessions, and if they're too stressed, well then they just need to be executed. At one point, Makishima makes the claim that this town is a parody of a book he once read, that book being Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, a title that most of you are likely familiar with, but I'm sure you're even more familiar with the film that was based on this book, Blade Runner. The plot of Blade Runner revolves around Officer Rick Deckard's position as a Blade Runner, an officer tasked with hunting down rogue replicants, which are bioengineered humanoids similar to androids, who were created to be used as slave labor. While there are no replicants in Psycho-Pass, the people of this world are treated in much the same way as rogue replicants if they deviate from the system, no matter who they might be, what they might be doing, or what they feel. If they're labeled to be latent criminals, there's no other option than to reprogram them or execute them. Now obviously therapy can be a great way to deal with stress, but forcing people into therapy because your system has assumed that if you don't, they might become a criminal in the future is just asinine, as just like with Hughes and the assignment of jobs and hobbies, crime coefficients do not account for the actual actions or reasons why a person might be stressed. It just scans for it, decides that it's too much, and labels them accordingly. This is made blatant for us with Shimazu, who wasn't considered a latent criminal before she was kidnapped, but became one in the eyes of the system when she experienced stress due to said kidnapping. And if Akane hadn't stepped in here, she would have suffered an unjust demise purely because the system was incapable of accurately determining why she was in such distress. Even if she had been sent to therapy though, that's no guarantee that things would have eventually turned out well for her, as criminals who have been sent to therapy aren't fully trusted to make a full recovery, especially ones who have a high crime coefficient, as those people are kept in a separate area that can be filled with poison gas at any time if they dare to rebel against the system. But shockingly, this isn't even the worst part about crime coefficients and the way Sibyl handles them, as that honor goes to the fact that even children can be labeled as latent criminals. One of the most harrowing things we learn over the course of this story is that Kagari, one of the enforcers assigned to Division 1, has been a latent criminal since he was 5 years old. And up until he was given the opportunity to be an enforcer, he was confined to a facility with other latent criminals like himself. And owing to the fact that that seemed to happen when he was a teenager, that means that Kagari spent the majority of his young life in a care facility. Why? Because there are no laws that protect juveniles in this society. And so when Sibyl scanned him when he was a child, it determined that one day he might grow into a criminal and acted accordingly. That's it. No crimes committed, no adverse behavior that landed him there. Just a kid being a kid that a group of psychopaths decided wasn't good enough to be included in their society. I don't think I really need to go too in depth here, as this is horrific and unjust, plain and simple. And honestly, this alone would be enough to claim that Sibyl is a monstrosity as far as I'm concerned. But of course, there's much more that still needs to be said about the fallacies of the Sibyl system. Now, as far as enforcing the law goes, that's dictated by the dominators, guns that decide whether someone needs therapy or needs to be executed. As we touched on with the Okura case, Sibyl doesn't necessarily care about investigating any crimes. It only cares that the employees of the Public Safety Bureau find criminals and either incapacitate them or eliminate them. And if they don't do that and attempt to go above and beyond, they get demoted to enforcers, like Kogami, who was demoted from inspector to enforcer because he prioritized an investigation over therapy treatments or elimination. So, with that in mind, you might think that the various drones and scanners Sibyl uses to detect criminals might be better suited to handling criminal activity. But as we learn once Makishima hands out the scanner evading helmets he's manufactured, that's not true at all. The drones and scanners that Sibyl uses are programmed to scan psychopaths and determine whether or not someone is a criminal by examining their crime coefficient. And that's all they're programmed to do. If someone is murdering someone right in front of them, they don't recognize that as criminal behavior because, well, they aren't programmed to recognize it. All they can do is scan, use the numbers they receive, and call the Public Safety Bureau to inform them of an incident. And while that seems to be fine on a day-to-day basis, once criminals start acting more openly, that becomes quite the issue, as we see once those helmets are handed out, as I mentioned a moment ago. Now, despite how flawed this system is, there's no doubting that for the vast majority of people, things are good. They might not necessarily be as happy as they could be, and they're all subject to suffering at some point due to the way this system handles their lives. But on the whole, people are happy, safe, and generally content. But like every good thing about Sibyl, this too comes with its own set of problems. With crime at a historic low, people placed in positions that are supposed to make them happy, and an absence of worry about anything related to health, society, or public safety, people have become docile, complacent, and fragile. The slightest disruptions in their daily routines are cause for an increase in stress. Minor inconveniences, ill news, anything of that sort is liable to cause people to react in ways they otherwise wouldn't have, were they more accustomed to and prepared for the various negative aspects of life. Young people these days aren't tolerant to stress and are easily affected by violent urges and compulsions. This is an observation from Masoka that sums this line of thinking up pretty well. If you aren't equipped to handle stressors, you won't handle them when they're presented to you, whether that be through lashing out or, as we saw when a man was murdering a woman with a helmet on, an inability to recognize when something is wrong, even when it's playing out right before your eyes. Order is maintained because everyone around you has been verified. It used to be that doubting others was the basis for maintaining order, but now there's no reason to doubt anyone or their intentions, as all doubts would have been dealt with by Sibyl. So why worry yourself over anything, even if it looks like a murder is being committed right in front of you? People are so fragile in this era that the police have to walk around wearing holograms depicting kawaii renditions of police officers when they're doing police work, and robots project the same image making announcements or when cordoning off areas. When you consider that a crime coefficient can be contagious, things become even more perilous, as the stress of one person can easily spiral others around them out of control until the area stress is elevated to such a degree that mass panic sets in and things begin to descend into chaos. People are even afraid to get addicted to alcohol, so they stick to virtual means of numbing their senses, but they're more than willing to take Sibyl-approved supplements for mental contamination if their stress levels increase. But as fragile as the citizens of Japan are in this new world, their fragility is nothing compared to that of a government run by the few that has lulled them into this false sense of security. As we've already discussed, Sibyl is a system that's run by a group of psychopaths that have made themselves into a living god, And in order to keep up the image of the all-pervasive God who serves and protects its people, they've taken drastic measures to ensure that control is maintained at all costs. One of the ways in which they've accomplished this is by turning Japan into an isolationist wet dream. Nearly all the food provided by Sibyl is manufactured using a substance called hyperoats, a genetically modified strain of oats that makes up 99% of the food in Japan. 99%. That's a dangerously high concentration of one's food supply into one item. And as we'll cover later once we start talking about Makishima, something that can be easily exploited by malefactors who are looking to harm society. What makes this even more harmful is the fact that Japan refuses to communicate with other countries due to its self-sufficiency. So if any crisis were to occur in the country, it would take weeks, possibly even months, for any international response to help pull them out of it, which could easily lead to the deaths of millions, something that's only made worse by the fact that Japan itself would not be equipped to handle such a crisis on its own due to its reliance on the Sibyl system, with seemingly no safeguards put in place to guard against such failures. No matter how perfect the system is made to be, it needs a safety net to deal with unforeseen circumstances, the ability to flexibly respond in an emergency, temporary measures for when the system malfunctions. The system becomes perfect once these things are included. For a system, rather than functioning perfectly, it's more important that people continue to trust that it's perfect. This is something Sibyl says to Akane when they're talking about the existence of the Public Safety Bureau and its employees. But for whatever reason, this same logic doesn't seem to apply to anything other than the police department, which is as negligent as it is dangerous. Speaking of the Public Safety Bureau, even that safety measure falls short, as though the small amounts of investigators and enforcers seems to be enough to combat criminal elements when things are going well. The fact that they're limited to only employing a few individuals to handle the small amounts of crimes that occur leaves plenty of room for mischief and chaos to quickly overwhelm any given area due to the lack of staff available to combat crimes on such a large scale, which is made evident for us after the helmet users begin rioting and the Public Safety Bureau becomes essentially useless in the face of the widespread panic that occurs. Aside from a lack of safety measures though, another detrimental aspect of Sibyl-run society is the fact that the structure of the government and businesses seem to be largely the same as it is in our own era. The handling of business by the government is dictated by profits and quotas in the same way that capitalist systems of today do, but the way they operate is also reminiscent of 5-year plans, an economic policy utilized by former communist countries that set a target for production that needed to be reached no matter the cost, whether that cost be in sacrificing other areas of industry or in sacrificing human lives. The best example we're given of this is when Division 1 goes to investigate a series of murders at a drone factory. Here, the manager of the company, Kuda Kurado, constantly impedes their investigation, stating that the disruption they'd cause would delay and harm the production goal set for them by the Ministry of the Economy. This is a classic example of profits being more important than people, as this man is more than willing to stop the police from possibly discovering a murderer lurking amongst the ranks of his employees, which not only doesn't allow any sort of justice for the victims, but ensures that more lives will be put at risk as this killer continues to operate within the facility unhindered. This is only made worse by the fact that this facility is cut off from the net, making it so it's nearly impossible for Sibyl's supposedly perfect system to conduct the scans it normally would to ensure public safety, as another rather dystopian aspect of this new world is that employees of various companies tend to live at their workplaces, so it's entirely possible that forcing this investigation to be concluded for the sake of profits would have allowed the murderer here, Yuji Kanehara, to continue killing indefinitely. Worse than that though, is that Yuji didn't just become a murderer for no reason. He became one because this company, being cut off from the net, and thus being incapable of delivering virtual means of stress relief to its employees, put in place an insanely draconian policy of using an employee as a whipping boy to reduce the stress levels of other employees, with the latest one being Yuji. So not only are these men living at their jobs and cut off from the rest of the world, but they're also encouraged to make life worse for one of their coworkers in order to ensure the mental stability of the rest of them. So if you couldn't tell, this Sibyl-centric society is far from being perfect. But when society is flawed, it's up to those that make up that society to step up to instigate the change needed to fix whatever issues might be plaguing them. However, that's nearly impossible for the people lorded over by Sibyl. There are very few people who actually desire to change things in this world, because so many of them have been lulled into complacency. For the vast majority of people, life is decent. It may not be excellent, but on a day-to-day basis, they're fed, housed, clothed, and entertained without ever having to worry about any of those things being in jeopardy due to the existence of Sibyl. So the thought of instigating any sort of change is something that doesn't even enter their minds. Furthermore, Most people aren't even aware of any flaws within the system because the system does such a great job of covering up any nasty things that might raise the stress levels of the populace, which means that most people aren't even aware that there are things that need to be changed. What makes this even more difficult is that the people in this society have nothing to compare the current state of affairs to that might cause them to reflect on whether or not the world they live in truly has changed for the better, or if the ideas of others that came before them might serve to help move their society in the right direction. When Akane is attempting to research the past to find out how Makishima might be judged when they capture him, she has the following conversation with Kunizuka. I never thought it would be this hard to research the past. It's something people have no interest in. No one would try to organize the data to make it easy to find. Oh, that's why most of the books Mr. Kogami read were print-based. Once data is online, it's easy for the system to manage it. Are you saying that researching itself isn't good? It's true that it's not recommended, right? Is that so? I heard that when Mr. Masoka was a child, history was almost a required subject. History was. What did people in the past think? What was their goal in building the society they lived in and managing it? If you take all the ideologies and mistakes repeated over time as a whole, you can probably imagine what an ideal future world ought to look like. However, this country is currently dominated by the Sibyl system, which we are told is the ultimate system that brings about a peaceful society. Given that, imagining a better society is utter madness. True, thinking that way is likely to cause one's psychopaths to get clouded. Right, it will, as it's designed that way. In addition, if you research history in depth, the current database is full of holes. What? All the data that's easy to obtain is there to assure us that the creation of this society we live in was inevitable. Any data that even hints at the possibility that other systems or ideologies may have been suitable for us is hidden away as if it never existed. Complacent, uninformed, and restricted from accessing any information that might cause them to believe that this perfect system might be less than that. For as Kunizuka said, why would you bother to imagine a better society when this society is already supposedly perfect? With all of these things in place, Sibyl remains flawed, yet eternal. But that eternality is easily exposed by exploiting the cracks within its foundation. And it would be all these detrimental aspects of this system that would lead to the creation of one of Sibyl's greatest enemies, who was ready to turn each of these cracks into chasms, Shogo Makishima. On the surface, Makishima is a rather pleasant person. He's handsome, elegant, sophisticated, well-read, and monstrously intelligent. But as a criminally asymptomatic person, or more appropriately, a psychopath, these surface-level aspects of his character, though true to who he is, only enhance the danger present within his person, transforming what otherwise might have been the perfect gentleman into a philosophical monstrosity, just waiting to bring this world he so despises to utter ruin. As we discussed towards the beginning of the video, Makishima and people like him are marked by an all-pervasive loneliness that's come as a result of their isolation from society due to their incompatibility with Sibyl, granting them the gift of antisocial personality disorder in the process. And as I stated earlier as well, this loneliness is something that Makishima actually comments on a few times throughout this story. You are the biggest source of strife in my crimes so far. Is the compass you carry accurate? I stand in a place that is light years away from this world's crime and punishment. Your usual means are not enough to catch up to me. In order to do so, you have to have an accurate compass and map inside of your head. Since I was a child, I haven't been good at playing alone. I was always seeking dichotomy. I like messing with dichotomy itself, just like deconstructionists. This is part of a thought that Makishima has when he's observing Kogami, and he has a similar one during his final confrontation with him. Solitude. Does that only apply to me? Who isn't alone in this society? The time when our connection to others was the basis of ourselves is long gone. In this world where everyone is watched over by the system and lives within the system's standards, a community isn't necessary. Everyone just lives in their own little cell, and the system tames them by giving them each their own personal serenity. Speculation by Kogami when he's having a conversation with Professor Sagai further supports this idea as well. The turning point was when he discovered he could control his psychopaths. He felt alienation because of it. In this society, if the Sibyl system doesn't recognize you, in a sense, isn't it the same as not being recognized as a human being? A child who wasn't accepted into the group. Now, why it's so important to factor in Makishima's loneliness when attempting to figure out his character is not just because it led to him becoming a psychopath, but because this loneliness was the catalyst for the development of his philosophy and mission. Imagine for a moment that you're a child standing at the edges of a playground, watching a horde of other children playing, but whenever you try to step into that playground to join in the fun, Something prevents you from doing so. Maybe you trip and hurt yourself. Maybe the other kids all ignore you as they run around and play with one another. Whatever the case may be, everyone else around you is not just enjoying the playground equipment, but the camaraderie that only a kid playing with other kids on that equipment can know and enjoy. In this analogy, the playground represents Sibyl and society, and the children playing on it, the people of Japan, a playground that Makishima was excluded from. And as a result, in his isolation, he became a psychopath. Not only did he develop this disorder that rendered him incapable of empathizing with others, but it rendered his existence to that of an observer. If you want to understand human beings, you need to do more than just watch them. You need to pay attention to what they themselves are watching. So says Makishima. And as an outside observer to the society Sibyl had created, that was all Makishima could do, observe. And though he must have felt maligned and jaded in his early years as a result of his exclusion from society, he came to the realization that the people who were enlightened by Sibyl's grace were in fact not so, and that they're not even to be envied. They're just drones, cogs in a machine, all of whom, to a certain degree, are the same. People who eat, sleep, work, and play to Sibyl's tune, while rarely having any thoughts of their own. And because Makishima had to find other aspects of life to look to outside of Sibyl in order to learn, grow, and entertain himself, he inevitably found his way to literature. Books that most people didn't know existed, and ones that told him in so many ways of what life was like before Sibyl, and how much more free, nuanced, and beautiful it was. So he read, and he observed, and by combining his disorder, the growing disgust he felt for the people he viewed as livestock, and the knowledge that things used to be different, and could be again, Makishima slowly became poisoned, first with rage, sadness, insecurity, and shame. But then, at some point, they evolved into something more: desire, curiosity, and a need to right the wrongs the world had inflicted upon him and the rest of humanity, to see whether or not things could be better if they were allowed to be the way they once were. Most people don't mind killing cows and chickens, but they'd probably have a hard time doing the same thing to chimpanzees. Partially, it's because chimpanzees bear a slight resemblance to humans, but the primary reason is that they can draw pictures. It's harder to kill animals that can draw. Instinctively in our own minds, we would say to ourselves, maybe they have feelings. That shows us how high a value we assign to expression. Since the beginning of the modern age, society has given up on pursuing absolute values. It's come to place the relative, comparative worldview as its center. However, it's not because we no longer need any absolutes in our lives. Rather, it's simply because we came to see them as sour grapes and started eliminating them. We thought, it's hard to adhere to these values, so let's pretend that such ideas never existed from the start. Then, the Sibyl system came to exist. The system started intervening even in art and culture. Sibyl authorized artists. Sibyl recommended works, because its decision criteria was as closed off as a black box. Agony and confrontation, which are necessary for growth, decreased. Any approach that holds contempt for free expression will eventually result in society dying of stagnation. This is one of the many soliloquies that Makishima delivers to us that conveys some of what his observations led him to conclude. But the conclusions Makishima came to, as much as they were enlightening, were dangerous. As most of you will know, Makishima's goal throughout this narrative was the destruction of the Sibyl system. But when we're presented with a character with such ambitions, it's important to pay attention to what they have to say about why they're doing what they're doing. So why was Makishima trying to do this? Was it really to right the wrongs that had been inflicted upon him and his fellow criminally asymptomatic people? Was it to free his people from a system he deemed to be an oppressor? No, nothing that noble or selfless. For as much as Makishima frequently proselytizes about the fallacies of Sibyl throughout this story, when you really listen to what he wants to do and look at what he does, you come to understand that Makishima did what he did for one person and one person only: himself. I think there's value in people only when they act based on their will. So I've asked many people about their suppressed free will and observed their actions all this time. Don't be so full of yourself. You're just a criminal. How do you define crime to start with? That dominator you're holding. Does the Sibyl system that governs that gun decide it? By analyzing a bioorganism's force field, read by a somatic scan, they figure out how a person's mind works. The intelligence of science finally uncovered the secret of souls, and this society changed drastically. However, people's wills are not a part of that assessment. I wonder just what sort of criteria you use to divide people into good and evil. I want to see the splendor of people's souls. I want to check and see if it really is precious. However, When humans base their lives around Sibyl's oracle without ever consulting their own wills, do they really hold any value? A pawn you can freely control by just redirecting his desires is nice and convenient, right? What are human desires? What I think the most troublesome desire is the desire for attention. It's the source of jealousy and relationship problems too. You don't seem to have much of it. I pride myself on having almost no desire for that. I wonder if it's the key to controlling my crime coefficient. Have you read The Conquest of Happiness by Russell? The opposite of boredom is not pleasure, but excitement. People will gladly seek out any kind of excitement, even pain. The Sibyl system is the very definition of boredom. Aging is quite similar to death. Some people stand up to aging and death as if it were nothing. They can do so not because they're braver than others, but simply because they lack imagination. Only once people deny that which they love do they become able to create it anew. Perhaps the book I write too will die one day just like my body will. However, people have to accept that death is unavoidable. They will probably be gone in 10 years. Their books will no longer exist in 100 years as well. People accept this. Eternality is promised neither to books nor to humans. We live because we were born. If the system possesses the power of life and death over you, you're no longer a human. You're livestock. No matter how hard a rancher tries to pretend otherwise, they never recognize their livestock as their friends. It's a mystery to me. How is it that these people, treated as livestock in this boring society, have not tried at all to destroy it? Nothing in this world is eternal. The only thing that truly exists is the splendor of the souls that atone for their sins. These are quotes from Makishima that sum up his desire, the desire to see the splendor in people's souls that has been suppressed by the Sibyl system. But the thing about this rationale is that never once does he state that he wants to free people from the shackles Sibyl has placed upon them for their own sake, only for his desire to see what they're capable of, so they might provide some excitement for him in this boring world he inhabits. At one point, he even calls himself ordinary and common, stating that he's never been avaricious and that all he wants to do is live in a world in which everyday things are done in an everyday way. In other words, a world like it was before Sibyl. He is a cynical man with a distorted sense of humor. He satirizes science and politics that have gotten too advanced. An observation made by Professor Saiga that serves as an apt description of Makishima's personality and the way he approaches the world. So, Makishima's goal is to see the splendor within people's souls, and to do so, he first targets people who he believes will entertain him once they're given a bit of freedom, and he watches as their stories unfold to see the splendor of their souls. In order to measure a person's worth, you must do more than push them. The real way to test their worth is to give them power. When they gain the freedom to act outside the boundaries of law and ethics, you can sometimes see their souls. When the weak become strong, when good citizens become free to engage in violence, I'm interested to see what the outcome of that is. I think people tend to reveal their true selves when they step into an avatar. They probably feel a sense of freedom, but freedom easily gained quickly turns into a false sense of omnipotence. His first subject for this experiment was Yuji Kanehara, the drone plant worker, giving him the disk he'd need to override the drone's programming so they could kill for him. And before he does so, he explains to his compatriot, Chogu-sung, what this disk, this first step, will accomplish for them. Is a pebble. If you throw a pebble into a pond, it creates ripples. In other words, it's like the domino theory or the butterfly effect. This is the domino that starts it all. We'll give those lost sheep a nudge in the right direction. They may simply end up as guinea pigs, or they may turn into wolves. We're doing this to find out which one they'll be. I wonder what kind of strife will arise from it. Clausewitz pointed out that no matter how carefully one plans, on the battlefield, even the smallest of details can be setbacks. Armchair strategizing only works in the realm of theory. What we're about to do might cause us strife as well, but I'd be lying if I say I'm not looking forward to it even a little bit. After this though, Makishima got a little more personal with his selections, instigating the crimes of Masatake Mido, Rikako Oryo, and Toyohisa Senguji, and each of these people ended up causing murder and mayhem in a plethora of different ways that led to the deaths of dozens of people. But each time he followed their stories, he ended up disappointed, realizing that these people were not who he thought they'd be, or proving themselves of being incapable of growing beyond their baser desires. And in that disappointment, we learn the most dangerous aspect of Makishima's desire. For if people's souls aren't as splendorous as he hoped they'd be, what happens then? What if, as he continues to study people and how they use their freedom, He finds them to be disappointing, like he did with these three. What then would be the next step? Genocide? Perhaps. Perhaps Makishima, after giving the entire world freedom, would have been disappointed with the result and would have endeavored to end the disappointment that is humanity. Though that may be true, fortunately for the world, he never had the chance to witness the wills of the populace on a large enough scale, but he got very close. We touched on it a bit earlier, but at one point in this story, Makishima unveils a device he manufactured, a helmet capable of fooling dominators and drones alike by rendering any person wearing one incapable of being scanned by latching onto the nearest and lowest crime coefficient of another person. He releases a slew of these devices to the people he believed worthy of using them, and the results end up being quite harrowing, with scores of people being brutalized or murdered as these people use their newfound freedom from Sibyl's restraints to cause as much mayhem as they wanted to. When a man faces fear, his soul is tested. What he was born to seek, what he was born to achieve, his nature will become clear. This was a tool to promote awareness, for people to live like human beings, and to stop them from living idle lives like livestock. People have been misled by Sibyl and have become unable to properly evaluate the danger in front of them. Potential criminals become criminal the moment they come to learn of the helmet. People who don't know the taste of honey won't try to steal it, even though they're obedient sheep under the Sibyl system. Give them a reason to, and they'll turn into mad dogs. That's what I've always thought. And in fact, it looks like that's how things will pan out. A society that has no place in it for criminals is unhealthy after all. Just like those who grew up in a perfectly disinfected environment are weaker than those who have been sick. It was as if one day, somebody had changed the rules stating that you could no longer have a civil war without genocide. More bits of philosophy, and a quote from Project Ito Makishima delivers that outlines his intentions here, and his hypothesis turned out to be true, to an extent. Yes, the people with the helmets did indeed become mad dogs, but there were plenty more people who didn't just stand idly by and let these mad dogs roam free and do as they wish. People who stood up to them and tried to protect themselves, their communities, and their loved ones from this newfound influx of criminals. And furthermore, his statement that a society without criminals is equivalent to an immune system that hasn't been exposed to sickness is a false equivalency. The flaws these helmets exposed in Sibyl seem to suggest that it's not, as the system was incapable of protecting its citizens here because it had assumed that it had eliminated the need to put plans in place just in case something like this would occur. But that doesn't mean that planning for things like this wouldn't work and that criminality is necessary for a society to function. It just highlights the fact that Sibyl specifically was unprepared to do so, which is a good thing to highlight, sure, but not if it means sacrificing perhaps hundreds or even thousands of innocent lives to do so. But this act, compared to what would have been his magnum opus, was mere child's play. While the riots were happening, Makishima tried to discover the secret of Sibyl's operation, and after half failing in that, and being caught by Sibyl and discovering the truth through them, he enacted his final plan, crippling Japan's food supply by introducing a virus to its hyperotes that would have ushered in a humanitarian crisis, the likes of which had never before been seen. For, as we touched on earlier, 99% of Japan's food supply was derived from hyperotes, and due to their isolation from the rest of the world, any aid from other countries would have been either slow-moving or non-existent, guaranteeing mass chaos, the deaths of millions, and most importantly for Makishima, an opportunity to observe the expression of free will on a greater scale. In the end though, Makishima is stopped by Division 1, and it's through this final battle, the interactions he has with them, and further evaluating the fallacies present in his philosophy and actions that we fully grasp the selfish, despicable, and senseless evil of Shogo Makishima. One of Makishima's fixations throughout this story was Shinya Kogami, the enforcer at the Public Safety Bureau who had been investigating Makishima for years, finding in him a parallel to himself that, instead of working to bring down the system, supported it. While the expression of free will he observed in people like Rikako and Mito ended up being a disappointment to him, Kogami consistently proved to be a worthy adversary, and a man who could excite him, the one thing in his entire life that had managed to make him feel that way. But he wasn't just an adversary, he was a potential soulmate, and not in the romantic sense, but a person like Makishima who could understand Makishima. And indeed, Kogami in many ways was like Makishima, and as he continued to chase him, his mind only descended further and further to the dark place where his opponents dwelt, much like Marlowe when he was pursuing Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, a novel which we spy Kogami reading at one point. But Kogami only began to think like Makishima for one purpose: to bring him to justice, for justice was what he served, true justice, and he would go to whatever lengths necessary to ensure that justice would be served, something that Makishima wasn't able to understand. For Makishima, justice was an afterthought. What he dealt in was life and all the possibilities of it, no matter how wonderful or deplorable. Good and evil were arbitrary as far as he was concerned. The only thing that mattered was people's wills and the need for them to be able to express them freely without restraint. He attempts to turn this on Kogami by stating that he isn't serving justice, but pursuing Makishima because he wants to, and that nothing else factored into his decision to do so but that fact alone. However, though it's true that Kogami ended up leaving the Public Safety Bureau in order to pursue Makishima unrestrained, and did so because he desired more than anything to capture him, he did not do so to capture him for the sake of it, but to protect people, to protect himself, his friends, and everyone else who might be hurt by Makishima's actions. For unlike Makishima, good and evil weren't simple constructs for Kogami. They were real as we've made them. It's not the final judgment of good and evil that's important. What matters is that you come to that decision yourself, that you agonize over it, and eventually accept it. This is something Makishima says to Akane, and at 2 different points in this story, he also questions what criteria people use when labeling things good and evil, and asks what gets to decide that. Sibyl, dominators. In Makishima's mind, the only thing that matters is a person's own decision, and it's the lines they draw after pondering the nature of morality and what they choose to do with their own free will as a result of their conclusions that truly matters. Just like with Sibyl's approach to managing society, however, that might sound fine in theory, but in practice, what would essentially be an anarchic system isn't even compatible with individual and family life, let alone civilization and society. Now, what I'm about to say is in no way indisputable, as I'm not the god of morality, and you're free to challenge me on this in any way you wish. But in past videos, I've talked a lot about something that I believe to be true, that being that in this world, there are certain things as far as morality goes that are typically considered good and evil by everybody, no matter who you are or where you might be from, and specifically, that there are certain baseline acts of evil that are nearly universally agreed upon to be evil, such as stealing, assault, wanton destruction, and murder. For example, if you were in Beijing, China, and you walked into someone's house and murdered their mother right in front of them, it's not like you could do the same thing anywhere else and get away with it, as if the Chinese somehow have a monopoly on considering murder to be wrong. No matter where you go, if you took that action, whether it was in a village in Papua New Guinea or a small town in Mexico, you're going to be seen as an evildoer. However, that's the baseline, which is to say that anywhere you go on this planet, stealing, assault, wanton destruction, and murder are going to be considered evil in some form. No matter where you go, you will be convicted if you walk into someone's home and murder their loved one for no reason. However, in some places, a father might have the right to murder his daughter if he dishonors his family. In others, seeking vengeance for a perceived wrongdoing might be acceptable. So yes, what is considered stealing, assault, destruction, and murder will vary depending on where you go, but the fact remains that no matter where you go, they are always wrong in one way or another. And why that's important to take into account when discussing the nature of good and evil is because it allows us to accept that there is a fundamental moral framework that all humans operate by in some way. And that moral framework is what allows us to make collective decisions regarding morality. And that's as true now as it was thousands of years ago, as even for a family of hunter-gatherers, there had to have been a moral framework they operated by, with mothers and fathers teaching their children that no, it's not right to steal your sister's food because she needs to eat too. And no, you shouldn't hit your brother over the head with a stick because he hurts in the same way you do. But why? If we all have our own free will and are capable of doing whatever we want, why bother? Why not just do whatever you like, when you like, and let others do the same? Because if we let each other do that, people get hurt or killed. And furthermore, civilization wouldn't even be a possibility, as it's only possible when people decide to work together for the betterment of all. But perhaps most importantly, because we all want to see ourselves and our loved ones live happy and healthy lives. And as we've continued to grow as a species, we've come to understand that others outside our circles, as well as their loved ones, also deserve the same. Because that's the thing. Everything we know about morality is either the result of divine intervention that was established by God or gods long ago that are fundamental aspects of the universe, or, in the absence of the divine, the result of a long evolution from families protecting one another, to other families protecting each other, to entire communities, villages, towns, cities, and nations doing much the same. But don't just take my word for it, because there's something that's one of the many pillars that props up our respective societies that serves as the perfect example of collective understanding of morality. Laws. Laws are the direct result of human beings coming together and deciding that some things are so wrong that they need to be codified and woven into the very fabric of our civilizations in order for civilization to function. And while we often fail in many ways to abide by or protect those laws, and some laws end up proving to be unjust, the fact remains that without them, we would have never come as far as we have. The law doesn't protect people. People protect the law. People have always detested evil and sought out a righteous way of living. Their feelings, the accumulation of those people's feelings, are the law. They're neither the provision nor the system. They're the fragile and irreplaceable feelings that everyone carries in their hearts. Compared to the power of anger and hatred, they're something that can quite easily break down. People have prayed for a better world throughout time. In order for those prayers to continue to hold meaning, we have to try our best to protect it to the very end. We can't just give up on it. This is something that Akane says to Kogami in the final episode of Season 1 that supports this line of thinking, and Kogami responds by saying if there ever comes a time when everyone feels that way, the Sibyl system will probably disappear. There will no longer be any latent criminals or enforcers. But, and that is a big but, for though I do believe it's true, we're still far and away from living in a world where everyone respects and upholds the law. But without anyone doing so at all, the world would be a much different and a much darker place. And with all this in mind, I believe it's more than right to claim that Makshima's notion of what good and evil is not only erroneous, but dangerous, a cancer that would spread throughout the world and destroy it, causing an untold amount of unjustified suffering and death in the process. However, as far as his overall philosophy is concerned, as I mentioned earlier in the video, in some ways, he was right. When Makishima is bringing about Mito's end, he asks him if he's ever read a play titled Saraba Eiga Yo by Shuji Terayama, and one of its central themes is that everyone is an agent for someone else, that we all either act on behalf of somebody or for somebody, no matter what we're doing, and that makes us incapable of acting according to our own wills. As how can we? We are, in one way or another, always agents for someone else's will. And he's right. People should be allowed to live their lives and express their wills in any way they wish. But the caveat to that statement that Makishima never seems to factor into his thought process is that they should be able to do so within reason. Nobody wants to see the so-called splendor within someone's soul if that splendor involves the murder of idols because they believe they can do their jobs better. Nobody wants to see the splendor of a young girl murdering other young girls for the sake of art. Nobody wants to see the splendor of a twisted old man hunting down others in order to feel alive. And they don't want to see these things because we have deemed them to be wrong. Wrong because they harm us, the people we love, or just people in general. But for a psychopath who doesn't have the capacity for empathy, Makishima was incapable of understanding just how wrong he was. For the sad truth of Makshima's existence is that he likely never knew what it meant to love, or to be loved, neither by Sibyl, society at large, and perhaps even his own parents and family members as a result. As sad as that might be, Makishima was still wrong, and because he was wrong, does that mean that Sibyl is the hero to Makshima's villain in this story? That the society it created is right? No, it's not, for that's another area where Makishima was right in a way. For Sibyl is flawed, and it does stifle the human spirit in so many ways as we discussed earlier in this video. However, that doesn't mean that it needs to be completely annihilated in one fell swoop, and that people need to die needlessly in order to make those changes. People may need to die as a byproduct of revolutionary activity, if it ever came to that, but such an undertaking would be played out by a collective group of people who have come together and decided change needs to be made for the betterment of all, and not because one psychopath decided to gather other psychopaths to him so he could turn the world into an exciting show filled with chaos, mayhem, and misery so he could finally relieve himself of his boredom. Yes, in many ways, the society Sibyl has created has made people into human cattle. But just as Sibyl judged people in order to make them into sheep, so too does Makishima judge these people worthless for being a part of that system. When Makishima declares to Akane that he thinks there's value in people only when they act based on their will, she responds by stating the following: "There's no way they don't. Are you saying that you decide their value? You judge someone's family, their friends. You judge the value of a happiness you've never felt." And it's true. Makishima decided people were worthless, and that free will was the end-all be-all of existence, and anyone who thought otherwise was judged to be wrong. For Makishima, in his infinite wisdom, of course knew what was best for people. But again, Makishima didn't do what he did for the sake of others. He did it for himself. And that, more than anything, is what allows us to claim that he is a villain, and a villain only, and not some anointed revolutionary seeking to bring about change, who happens to believe doing so means entertaining villainy. If there's something beyond the destruction, that's good. If there isn't, then I'll accept it. Something Makishima says that shows us how unconcerned he was with what misery his actions would cause, with another line he delivers showing us his childish and selfish desire to treat the lives of others as merely pieces on a board game that he could move in any way he wished. I'm not into being an umpire or referee, because then I couldn't enjoy the game. I love this game people call life from the bottom of my heart, so I'd like to continue to participate in it as a player, forever and ever. So yes, both Makishima and Sibyl were wrong. And appropriately, Makishima meets his end at the hands of a man dedicated to upholding what's right, so the wrongs people like Makishima would inflict on this world might be erased. A man who was Makshima's parallel, who understood him more than anyone else ever could. But as Makishima points out, much like the doctor in Balnabari from Gulliver's Travels, many of the solutions Sibyl provides are useless and wrong in many ways. And since Sibyl is still functioning at the time of Makshima's demise, what should be done to rectify the misery that Sibyl also causes? Well, the answer to that is not an easy one, because in truth, there is no way of knowing what the right answer is in a scenario like this, until an answer is made into action and judged after the fact, with retrospect only cluing us into how things may have played out differently if other measures were taken. But if we look to how Akane's story concludes at the end of this season, we find one of the best possible paths to making changes in this world dominated by Sibyl. Akane, despite learning what Sibyl is, makes the choice to continue working for Sibyl and to live in the society it created. Because Akane understands that the current society can't hold without Sibyl, and while the current society has its flaws, something similar to the riots that occurred when Makishima unleashed his helmets would play out, where after its collapse, great strife would occur until something or someone came along to stabilize society again. But Akane knows that so long as there are people like her who know the truth, and there are others who strive to know the truth, that changes are always capable of being made. Do you know the most demeaning thing you can do to the law that should be sacred? Creating and administering a law that is unworthy of protection. You shouldn't underestimate humans. We're always aiming for something better. We're always aiming for a better society. Someone will come to this room someday to turn off the power. We will find a new path for sure. Sibyl system, you guys have no future. This is the last thing Akane says to Sibyl, and it's true. Humans will always find a way to right any wrongs that are presented to them. When Akane is imagining a conversation with her slain friend, Yuki Funahara, about life under Sibyl, they have the following exchange. It was fun and easy. I didn't experience any hardship at all. Someone else always took care of things for me, and I never even asked myself what was important. Say, Akane, do you think I was still happy that way? Akane responds by saying, you could have become happy. You could have searched for the answer any time. As long as people are alive, anyone can do it. And it's true. People might become livestock, sheep that are guided by a shepherd who has no business leading them. But so long as they're alive, no matter how miserable they or the world might seem, they're always capable of making changes and finding happiness. The question in this case is, would a total collapse of the Sibyl system bring about that happiness? Or is assuming that it would more dangerous than allowing Sibyl to exist? In this case, I think it is. If a system is totalitarian in nature, and it doesn't allow for people to make incremental or significant changes within that system without resorting to violence, then that violence becomes a necessary evil. But if a system is not like that, then action should be taken to mitigate the loss of life when making changes in any way that an individual or a group can. And as far as Sibyl goes, some people are miserable, and some are treated quite unfairly. But on the whole, Sibyl provides for people, keeps them safe, well-fed, and healthy. So is it better then to totally destroy Sibyl in order to make things potentially better immediately, while potentially sacrificing the lives of thousands, if not millions of people in the process? Or is it better to make changes where you can and attempt to rework the system or destroy it without having to sacrifice so many innocent lives to do so? Again, I think so, but who knows? Maybe we'll have more answers to these questions when I cover the rest of this story. But for now, it's safe to say that Sibyl embodies a great amount of evil, an evil that people like Makishima weren't wrong to revile. But Makishima detested Sibyl for all the wrong reasons, and it was through his disillusionment with that system that he formulated a worldview that could very well have led to the destruction of the entire planet had his influence been allowed to grow. all for the sake of alleviating his own boredom. And no matter what we may think of Sibyl, the fact remains that the monster it helped to create should be praised by none and derided by all as a deceptively brilliant bastion of evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Shogo Makishima? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially our Dark Lord channel members, Elijah Kai VA, Effigy, Mr. Awesome, Lord N, Just Keeping It Real, Gunamain, and Tony Deza 8504, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.